What if the sign that God isn't done with you doesn't walk in on 2 legs, but limps in on 4? A 59-year-old veteran, alone in a trailer and sure his best chapters are over, hears a broken bark in the dark and finds a half-starved German shepherd chained and thrown away like trash. When he chooses to unclip that chain, he has no idea he's about to expose a cruel secret, bring justice to dozens of forgotten animals, and receive a miracle that will drag his own heart back to life. Before you begin, help us grow by subscribing. The wind came first, rolling down from the hills and across the edge of town, tugging at loose signs and rattling the tin roofs of the old storage units that sat like a row of tired soldiers along the 2-lane highway. On nights like this, the town of Fairview felt more like a memory than a place. Its few streetlights flickering over empty parking lots and shuttered storefronts, while out at the far edge, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and dust, a single trailer glowed faintly against the dark. That was where Martin Hale lived, in a narrow home of aluminum and dents, parked beside the storage yard he watched over for a living. At 59, he was lean in the way of a man who had never quite learned how to relax. His shoulders still broad beneath his red and black buffalo plaid jacket, his jeans hanging straight on long legs that moved with quiet efficiency. His hair had gone mostly gray, clipped short, with silver flaring at his temples, and his face was mapped with the kind of lines that come from sun, squinting, and too many nights thinking instead of sleeping. His brown eyes were soft when he smiled, but most days they stayed serious, as if they were still looking for something that hadn't made it home. In the mornings, Martin's world shrank to simple routines. He pulled on his cream-colored t-shirt, the familiar flannel jacket, the worn brown boots that had molded to his feet over years of standing, waiting, walking the same strips of concrete. He unlocked the small office by the pumps, turned on the overhead light that hummed with age, and laid his hand for a moment on the counter as if greeting an old friend. Drivers came and went, truckers with heavy lids and travel mugs, young parents in minivans, an occasional retiree pulling a camper. He helped them fuel up, pointed them toward the restroom, took payments in cash or card, slid rental contracts across the counter to locals wanting a unit to store furniture, boxes of memories, or equipment they swore they'd use again someday. He watched without judgment. People brought their whole lives in the back of pickup trucks and left them behind metal doors, and Martin was the quiet witness who locked those doors at dusk. The pay was enough to keep the trailer warm in winter and cool in summer, enough to restock the pantry and replace the occasional pair of socks, but not much more. What it didn't do was quiet the nights. When the sun went down and the last car pulled away, the silence around the storage yard became loud. He would sit at the small kitchen table in the trailer, the dim overhead light casting a yellow circle on the chipped surface. Hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. On the wall opposite him hung nothing but a nail without a picture. He had never decided what belonged there. Once, there might have been photographs, faces from another life, but those lived folded in a shoebox under his bed now. Too much and not enough to look at. Sometimes when the wind died down, he could almost hear another kind of noise. Rotors beating air, the crack of distant fire, a medic shouting over the roar of engines. In those moments, his hand would drift to his left wrist, fingers resting on the cool metal of his military watch. He'd stare at the ticking seconds and remember a different desert, a different night, and the feeling, sharp as shrapnel, that he had not been fast enough to reach the man calling his name. That feeling had followed him home like a shadow no one else could see. It was on one of those evenings, as winter edged closer, that the owner of the yard stopped by. Harold Benton was in his late 60s, a thick-set man with a soft belly under his windbreaker and a full head of thinning white hair, combed back carefully as if it still obeyed him. His face was ruddy, with a nose that suggested lifelong acquaintance with beer and bad weather, and his blue eyes held the wary friendliness of someone who had built everything he owned, one small risk at a time. "Marty," Harold said, tugging his jacket tighter as a gust of cold air slipped between the units. "You ever think about putting down something permanent?" Martin had smiled in that small, sideways way of his, more with one corner of his mouth than the other. "This feel pretty permanent to me," he'd replied, nodding toward the trailer and the low office. Harold snorted. "I'm serious. That backlot, all gravel and weeds. I'm tired of paying taxes on dirt nobody wants. I'd let it go cheap, real cheap. You could own it outright." Together they had walked to the rear of the yard, boots crunching the uneven stones underfoot. The back lot was a wide, open rectangle of compacted gravel, fenced on two sides with chain link sagging in places, the other sides open to scrub and the hint of pasture beyond. A single floodlight on a crooked pole tried and failed to make it look less lonely. To most eyes, it was nothing. Just leftover land the main business didn't need. A place where wind gathered leaves and litter, where no one parked unless they had to. Harold had spread his hands. "See? Worthless. But it's an extra parcel on my books. You take it, I write it up so you can pay me a little each month. We both sleep better. You could, I don't know, put a shed on it. Grow something if you're crazy enough." He'd laughed, but Martin had not. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, feeling the cold settle into his fingers, his gaze tracing the rough edges of the lot. Worthless, Harold had said. And maybe that was true on paper. But Martin thought of all the times he had held men's hands in the dust and told them they were not alone, that they were not just bodies on a list. He thought of how it had felt to come home and realized that while the country thanked him with words, the world itself had no particular place waiting with his name on it. This ugly rectangle on gravel, this forgotten corner of a small-time business, could become something else. Not a miracle, not a fresh start with fanfare, but a line on a deed. Proof that somewhere on this earth there was a piece of ground that belonged to him and only him. "People will say it's a waste," Harold went on, shrugging. "Town's already got more storage than it needs. Nobody's building out here. But if you want it, we'll make it easy. I'd rather see you have it than keep tripping over it on my balance sheets." Martin had simply nodded, the decision settling in him like a weight that, strangely, made him feel a little more solid. "Let me think on it," he'd said, though in his bones he already knew the answer. Having something with his name on it, even if it was just a patch of stubborn gravel, felt like a quiet rebellion against the idea that his life was already over. That night, long after Harold's truck taillights had disappeared down the highway, Martin walked his usual patrol between the rows of storage units. The wind had sharpened, knifing through the flannel of his jacket, carrying with it the faint smell of rain that might or might not arrive. Above him, clouds dragged across a thin slice of moon, and the metal doors on either side stood shut, each padlock a small, silent promise that whatever lay inside was safe from the world for one more night. He moved slowly, beam of his flashlight sweeping over concrete and corners, checking for broken locks, for teenagers looking for trouble, for anything out of place. There was comfort in the repetition, the crunch of his boots, the soft clink of keys at his belt, the way his breath misted in front of him. It made the night feel orderly, containable. Halfway down the farthest row, near where the units gave way to the empty back lot, he stopped. The wind had dropped for a heartbeat, leaving a pocket of stillness so sudden it felt like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. In that fragile quiet, something brushed the edge of his hearing, a thin, strained sound that didn't belong to metal or wind. It came again, a low, ragged noise, somewhere between a whine and a moan, carried faintly from the direction of the worthless gravel yard. Martin turned his head, listening, his body going instinctively still the way it had once done in darker places when danger might be hiding in the silence. The flashlight hung loose at his side, its beam pooling at his boots, as his heart gave a small, inexplicable lurch. Out here, at the edge of town, among padlocked doors and abandoned things, what could possibly be calling out into the cold? The next night the wind returned, thinner but sharper, threading its way through the rows of storage units and along the chain-link fence like a restless whisper. Martin had told himself, as he made coffee and shrugged into his red and black jacket, that the sound he'd heard the night before had been nothing more than metal complaining or a loose piece of gutter rattling in the gusts. That explanation had sat in his mind all day like a stone he tried not to notice. And yet when darkness settled and the yard emptied out, he found his boots carrying him toward the far row again, flashlight in hand, as if some older instinct had its own map. The gravel crunched underfoot in the same familiar rhythm, the keys at his belt chimed quietly, and overhead the sky had cleared, revealing a scatter of cold stars watching from very far away. He moved past the numbered doors, his beam grazing over padlocks, corners, the places trouble liked to lurk. The emptiness pressed close, heavy but oddly expectant. Then, cutting through the rattle of the wind, he heard it. Not the thin, dying moan of the night before, but a hoarse, broken bark that snagged in the air like a torn cloth. It came once, twice, then faltered into a strangled whine, as if something were trying to call out and being choked off midway. Martin stopped so suddenly the gravel slid under his boots. The bark came again, from farther back, beyond the last unit, in the direction of the so-called worthless lot. His hand tightened around the flashlight, knuckles whitening, and for a heartbeat, his body remembered another time when unexpected sounds in the dark had meant ambush or wounded men. "Easy," he muttered under his breath, not sure if he was talking to himself or to whatever was out there. He turned toward the back corner of the property, where the floodlight barely reached and a thin veil of mist had settled close to the ground, stirred into little ghosts by the wind. As he stepped off the concrete and onto the rougher gravel of the back lot, the cold bit more fiercely at his cheeks and nose. The flashlight beam cut a narrow tunnel through the haze, catching on rusted barrels, a stack of discarded pallets, the sagging line of fence crowned with crooked barbed wire. The barking had stopped. In its absence, his own breathing sounded too loud. "Hello?" he called softly, feeling faintly foolish for talking to the night. No answer. He moved toward the far corner where an old warehouse building sat, unused, its metal siding streaked with years of dust and rain. The back wall formed a dim alcove with a support post, a place people rarely had reason to go. As the light swept across that shadowed angle, it struck on something that did not belong to metal or gravel. A patch of matted fur, a glint of eyes that caught and held the beam. The German shepherd stood there, or tried to. He was tethered by a heavy chain to the base of a steel column, his body angled as if he'd been pacing, within the narrow radius allowed to him until he no longer had the strength. Even in the weak light, Martin could see how thin he was. Ribs pressed tight against skin beneath the muck and tangles, hips jutting sharply like hard corners under a blanket. The coat that should have been a proud mix of black and tan was clumped with dirt. Old mud dried into stiff ridges, and there were patches where the hair had thinned, exposing rawer skin beneath. Along both flanks ran faint, shiny lines, the pale tracks of scars that had healed but never quite disappeared, like the ones Martin knew some of his own men carried under their shirts. The dog looked to be around 7, maybe 8 years old. Grown, but not yet old in dog years, though something in the set of his frame suggested he had lived those years at double weight. His legs were steady enough to hold him, but they trembled slightly, and his paws were cracked, the nails too long, as if no one had trimmed or cared for them in a long time. What held Martin more than any of that was the animal's eyes. They were a deep, dark brown, almost black in this light, framed by expressive brows that now drew in with wary attention. The dog did not lunge or bare his teeth when the flashlight beam found him. Instead, he stood very still, head lowered just a little, muscles tense but contained, watching the stranger approach. There was fear there, certainly, but it wasn't the wild, snapping terror of an unhandled animal. It was the guarded watchfulness of someone who has learned that people mean pain more often than not, yet still weighs each new face like a new verdict. Martin stopped a good 10 feet away, lowering the beam so it wouldn't blind the animal, letting his own posture soften, shoulders easing down, one hand open at his side. "Hey there," he said quietly, his voice going instinctively to the low, even tone he'd once used around military working dogs overseas. "Easy, buddy. I hear you." The shepherd's ears flicked forward at the sound, then laid back again, torn between curiosity and the instinct to protect himself. The chain rattled softly as the dog shifted his weight. It was looped through a collar made of plain brown leather, stained from sweat and weather, with no tags, no stamped nameplate, nothing to say where he'd come from or to whom he was supposed to matter. The collar sat a little too tight against the sinewy neck, as if it had been fitted for a stronger, healthier version of this same dog, and never loosened as the body beneath it shrank. Martin's chest tightened at the sight. He knelt slowly, joints protesting as cold crept through his jeans at the knees, and extended his left hand, palm down, fingers relaxed. Memories flickered at the edge of his mind, standing in a sandy compound, offering the same gesture to a lean canine with intelligent eyes, the handler beside him laughing. "He'll judge you before any of us do, Sergeant." Back then, the dogs had been partners, treated as assets, yes, but also as comrades. This one looked more like a tool that had been used until nearly breaking. "You remind me of someone," Martin murmured. He tried a short, clipped command, an old word buried in muscle memory, the kind meant to reassure a working dog that the person in front of them was friend, not threat. The shepherd flinched at the sound, then, to Martin's surprise, inched forward one careful step, stretching his neck to sniff the air between them. A low whine escaped his throat, rough as if it hadn't been used for anything but barking in a long time. But the sound held more question than warning. Martin could smell the animal now, a mixture of dog musk, cold air, and the sour tang of neglect. "That's it," he said softly. "You know this game, don't you? Somebody trained you once." The dog's nose brushed the back of his hand, quick and light, then retreated half an inch, as if afraid of what might follow if he dared to trust fully. His tail hung low, not tucked entirely between his legs, but far from wagging, held in that uncertain middle ground that said he was waiting to see which way the world would tilt this time. The more Martin looked, the more the details piled up into a story he did not like. The worn patch of dirt under the dog's feet, where he had circled and circled, the empty metal bowl just out of reach, the way the chain cut a clean line through the grime on his fur, where it had dragged and rubbed. This wasn't a dog that had slipped away from a loving home and gotten lost. This was someone's property, left here, out of sight, as if the back corner of a storage yard were no different from a dumpster behind a restaurant. Anger stirred in Martin, slow and unfamiliar. He wasn't a man given to outbursts, but something about the quiet suffering in front of him snagged on the part of him that still believed his job in this life was not to turn away. Yet another part of him, the one that had learned how quickly good intentions could cost lives or livelihoods, whispered questions. Who had chained this dog here? What would they do if they came back and found him gone? Did he have any legal right to interfere? Or would he be stealing what the law would call someone else's asset? The wind pushed at his back, cold and insistent, tugging at the open hem of his jacket as if urging him either closer or away. He couldn't quite tell. He imagined walking back to the trailer, closing the door, telling himself it wasn't his business, that the world was full of hard stories and he couldn't rewrite them all. Perhaps another person would come. Perhaps whoever owned this animal would remember he existed. But as the shepherd shifted his weight again, the chain scraping the metal post with a tired clink, the dog's gaze locked onto Martin's with a clarity that made it hard to breathe. There was no accusation in it, no plea he could name, just a simple, raw awareness, as if for this moment. In this forgotten corner of the yard, Martin was the entire world, and the world was deciding. He knew, with a certainty that settled somewhere deep and heavy, that if he turned his back now, no one else was likely to hear this hoarse bark in the dark and follow it. The question that remained, coiling tight in his chest as he knelt there in the cold, was whether he had any right and enough courage left to unchain a life that someone else saw only as a piece of property. For a long moment, Martin stayed on his knees in the gravel, hands still hovering in that narrow space of air between his fingers and the shepherd's nose. The dog's eyes held his, searching, measuring, and something in that gaze tipped the balance. The part of him that counted risks and liabilities whispered that he should walk away, call someone, let some official system sort this out. But the older voice, the one that remembered men bleeding out in sand while red tape knotted itself miles away, rose up stronger. Before he could talk himself out of it, his hand moved past the dog's muzzle to the chain. The metal was cold and slightly greasy under his fingers. He followed it to where it looped around the steel post, secured with a cheap padlock so rusted it looked as if no one had expected to open it again. He fished his key ring out, tried a few just in case, habit more than hope, and when none fit, he tightened his jaw, stood, and yanked the chain up hard, bracing his boot against the post. It took more effort than it should have. His shoulders complained, and a flare of pain shot down his back. But the bracket holding the chain finally gave with a screech, wrenching free a strip of mangled metal. The dog flinched at the noise, but didn't bolt. He simply watched, breath puffing white in the cold, as if he'd seen worse chaos than this. "All right," Martin panted, lowering the chain with more care than he'd used to tear it loose. "That's one prison break." He eased closer, fingers working at the clasp on the leather collar. This, at least, opened with a simple squeeze, and when it came free, he drew the collar away, but kept his other hand resting lightly against the dog's neck so he wouldn't feel abandoned in the sudden slackness. The shepherd's skin twitched under his touch, but he didn't pull away. When Martin stepped back and gestured, the dog hesitated, then took a single, halting step toward him, moving like someone testing ground that might give way. Leading him across the lot to the trailer, Martin moved slowly, letting the dog choose the pace. The chain he'd torn free he left coiled by the post. There would be questions about that later, he knew. But they belonged to a future he couldn't see yet. Right now there was only the soft clack of the dog's nails on the gravel. the faint rattle in his breathing. The awkward dance of a man and animal learning each other's distance. At the trailer steps, the shepherd paused, glancing up at the narrow doorway as if it were some kind of test. "It's not much," Martin said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the peeling paint, the dented door, the cramped life inside. "But it's dry, and I've got clean water." He climbed the steps first, then turned and patted his thigh. "Come on." The dog gathered himself and hopped up, stumbling just a little on the top step, his hind legs slow to catch up. Inside, the small space filled instantly with his presence, the shape of him in the doorway, the smell of damp fur and cold air rushing in. Martin shut the door on the night, and the wind became a muffled hum instead of a sharp voice. In the lamplight, the shepherd looked even rougher. Martin could see the crusted mud along his belly, the tangles behind his ears, the dullness where a coat should shine. He spread an old, faded blanket on the floor beside his bed, a soft island between the wall and the narrow walkway, and filled a mixing bowl with warm water from the tap. The dog watched every movement with that same steady intensity, ears flicking at the sound of running water, nose following the steam that rose when Martin added just enough hot to take the chill off. "We'll do this the gentle way," he murmured, lowering himself to the floor with a grunt. He dipped a rag into the bowl, wrung it out, and reached for one of the dog's forelegs. "If you object, you let me know." The shepherd's muscles tensed, but he did not yank his paw away. He stood, shifting a little under the unfamiliar contact, while Martin worked the cloth along the leg, loosening the dried filth and revealing the wiry, surprisingly sturdy limb beneath. Up close, the scars along his sides were clearer, pale lines overlaid on older, fainter ridges, telling of more than one incident, more than one time the world had cut into him. As Martin worked, his mind drifted back years to another night, another body on a floor, this one human, his friend Daniel Ranger Ortiz laughing as he shook off sand after a mission gone sideways. "You worry too much, Hale," Daniel had said, tossing a towel at him. "Some of us are built for rough landings." A week later, there had been nothing left to towel off. The memory flickered, sharp and unwelcome. But as he rinsed the cloth again and ran it gently along the dog's neck, he found himself saying aloud, "You earned that name more than he got to." The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. "Ranger," Martin tried, testing how the word felt now, directed at this creature with the old soldier's eyes. The dog's head tilted almost comically, as if surprised by the label, and for the first time, his tail gave a slow, uncertain swish against the blanket. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was something leaning in that direction, and Martin felt a small knot in his chest loosen by a fraction. "Yeah," he said softly. "Ranger will do." He finished wiping down the dog's legs and sides as best he could, then set the bowl aside and laid a hand along the newly cleaner fur. "Lie down," he coaxed, patting the blanket. Whether it was the tone or some long-ago training, Ranger folded himself down with a weary sigh, curling so that his back pressed against the base of the bed. His breathing slowed, the harsh edge rounding off as warmth began to seep into his bones. Martin filled another bowl with fresh water and slid it close. Ranger lifted his head and drank, gulping at first, then more slowly, as if remembering how to pace himself. When he finished, he rested his head on his paws, eyes half closed but never entirely off the man, moving around the small space. Martin went through the motions of his own nightly routine, hanging up his jacket, setting his boots by the door, checking the lock twice, feeling for the first time in a long time that he was not entirely alone in the room. The trailer felt different with 2 heartbeats in it. The silence thinner, easier to breathe through. Even the old military watch on his wrist seemed to tick in a less accusatory way. Before he turned off the light, he looked down and found Ranger's head nestled so close to the side of his bed that his nose brushed the frayed hem of Martin's jeans where they hung over the edge. "We'll see about tomorrow," he whispered into the dimness. "One night at a time." Morning brought a pale, washed-out light through the narrow window, and the creak of Martin's joints as he swung his legs out of bed. For a second, he wondered if the night before had been some odd dream. But the sight of Ranger lifted his doubts away. The dog was lying exactly where he'd fallen asleep, on the blanket, head near the bed, eyes opening as soon as Martin moved. There was a stiffness to the way he rose, but also a quiet readiness, as if he had spent years being roused at commands and now woke at the smallest cue. Martin pulled on his cream t-shirt and jacket, laced his boots, and gave the dog a considering look. "We're going to town," he said, more to hear how it sounded out loud than because Ranger would understand. "Vet's going to have opinions about you." At the word vet, Ranger merely blinked. Martin took that as a good sign. He found an old length of webbing and fashioned a temporary leash, looping it gently through the leather collar he'd freed and now refastened, this time with the buckle set looser. "You're not property," he muttered under his breath. "But you do need to walk on something I can hold on to." The town's veterinary clinic sat in a low brick building near the grocery store, with a faded sign that read Fairview Animal Care and a row of neatly trimmed shrubs out front. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, dog fur, and the faint sweetness of treats. The woman who stepped out from behind the counter when Martin pushed the door open was in her mid-50s, of average height, but carrying herself with an easy, grounded confidence. Her dark blonde hair, streaked generously with gray, was pulled back into a loose ponytail that had escaped in soft wisps around a face lined more by smiling than frowning. She wore simple scrubs under a pale blue jacket, and her hazel eyes swept over Ranger with practiced quickness before flicking up to Martin's. "You must be our excitement for the morning," she said, voice warm with just enough humor to take the sting out of being the center of attention. "I'm Dr. Karen Lewis. Let's get him into an exam room." As they walked down the short hallway, another woman joined them from a side door, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked to be about Martin's age, maybe a year or two younger, with a slender frame that still held a certain strength, like someone who had spent much of her life carrying more than her share and had not quite stopped. Her hair, a soft silver brown, was cut in a practical bob that framed a gentle, oval face. Faint freckles still dotted her nose, softened by time. She wore a plain cardigan over a cream blouse and dark slacks, and there was a simple gold band on a chain around her neck instead of on her ring finger. Her gray-green eyes rested on Ranger first, softening with immediate concern, and then lifted to Martin with a kind of quiet recognition, the look of someone who knows what it is to worry over a living soul. "Linda Brooks," she introduced herself, offering a small smile as she held the exam room door. "I help out here when they'll let me." Her voice was low, a little husky, and carried the calm of someone used to sitting beside sick beds. In the bright, clean light of the exam room, Ranger seemed smaller and more fragile, his ribs more obvious, the scars more stark against his dull coat. Dr. Lewis ran experienced hands along his spine, ribs, legs, murmuring observations, half to herself, half to the room. "Good bone structure," she said, gently lifting one of his paws. "Muscle wasting from disuse and underfeeding. Teeth look decent. No major breaks. I'd guess about 7, maybe pushing 8. He's been through some hard use, though." She pointed out areas of calloused skin on his shoulders and chest, places a harness might have rubbed over and over. This is working dog wear, not the usual family pet stuff. Linda moved softly around them, keeping a hand near Ranger's head, stroking just behind his ears whenever he tensed. "You're all right, sweetheart," she crooned. "We're just looking. No one's going to hurt you here." Ranger, remarkably, stayed still, his only protest a low, uncertain whine when the stethoscope pressed cold against his side. Each time Martin was there, resting his hand lightly on the dog's neck, feeling the rapid thud of the heart beneath skin and fur. When Dr. Lewis passed a scanner over Ranger's shoulders and it beeped, Martin felt his stomach tighten. The vet walked to the computer, typed in the numbers, and a moment later her brows drew together. "Well," she said slowly, "he's chipped. Registered to Sentinel Protective Services out on Route 19. She clicked a little more, lips compressing. "Big outfit. They use a lot of dogs. There have been rumors." Linda's eyes flicked to Martin, worry sharpening the softness there. "Folks say they run their animals hard," she added quietly, "and when they slow down, they're replaced. Like broken equipment." Her gaze dropped to Ranger's scars, then back up. "If you try to keep him, they won't be happy about it." The room seemed to shrink a little, the air thickening around Martin's shoulders. Ranger had been lying down by then, head resting on his paws. But at the change in the humans' voices, he lifted his head and pressed it gently against Martin's leg. The weight was nothing, really, but it landed like a question. Would he be this dog's person now, with all the trouble that might bring? Or would he step back and let someone else decide Ranger's fate? It took only a few days for Linda's warning to stop being hypothetical. Late one morning, while Martin sat on the bench in the vet clinic's small waiting room, with Ranger lying at his feet, the soft jangle of the bell above the front door was followed by the heavy growl of an engine idling outside. Through the glass, he caught a glimpse of a gleaming black pickup, the kind that looked more at home in a dealership brochure than on a dusty side street in Fairview. A man stepped in as if the place belonged to him the moment he crossed the threshold. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a gym-fed build under a dark leather jacket that fit too perfectly to have seen much real wear. His hair was a controlled dark brown wave, cut close at the sides, and his clean-shaven face had the tanned, almost polished look of someone who spent more time in front of clients than in the sun. His eyes were a flat, pale blue that moved quickly, taking in the room with a practiced sweep. "I'm looking for a German shepherd brought in a couple days ago," he announced, tone clipped, businesslike, as if ordering a part. "Chip ID ending in 974. Belongs to Sentinel Protective Services." When his gaze landed on Ranger, it sharpened, and a small, satisfied smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. "There he is." Dr. Karen Lewis appeared from the back, wiping her hands on a towel, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly as she took in the newcomer. "You must be from Sentinel," she said. "And you are?" The man didn't bother with a handshake. "Clint Maddox," he replied. "Regional Operations Manager. That dog is company property, and we're here to recover him." The plural, we, resolved a second later when the clinic door opened again to admit a uniformed deputy from the county sheriff's office. A man in his early 30s, lean, with a neatly trimmed beard and short-cropped, sandy hair. His tan uniform sat a little stiff on his frame. His brown eyes were watchful but unsure, as if he'd already realized he was in over his head. The nameplate on his chest read, "Deputy Harris." He gave Karen a small nod, then glanced between Clint and Martin, who had risen to stand beside Ranger, one hand resting instinctively on the dog's shoulder. Linda emerged from an exam room behind them, still in her cardigan, her silver-brown hair slightly mussed, a smear of something that looked like flour on her sleeve, as if she'd been baking before rushing over. Worry etched deeper into the lines at the corners of her gray-green eyes when she saw who was standing in the middle of the clinic. "That company property," Karen said evenly, "came in underweight, dehydrated, and covered in scars from hard use. He was chained in the back lot of a storage yard with an empty water bowl." Clint let out a short laugh, void of amusement. "It's a temporary training site," he said. "Our dogs work. That's what they're bred and trained to do. They're valuable assets, not porch ornaments." He turned his attention fully to Martin then, looking him up and down, red-black plaid jacket, worn jeans, scuffed boots, as if assessing a problem to be solved. "You're Hale, right? The yard attendant. My men say you removed company property from private training grounds. That's theft." Ranger's ears flicked back at the edge in the man's voice, and he pressed a little closer to Martin's leg, the weight of his head solid against denim. Martin felt his own pulse tick faster, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "Name's Martin," he said. "I found this dog chained in the far corner of the storage yard I manage. No shelter but a rusted wall, no food in reach, skin and bones. If that's your idea of training, you and I have different dictionaries." Clint's jaw tightened. "You don't get to define our protocols," he shot back. "We rotate dogs through different environments. He was secured, and he's clearly still alive. So spare me the dramatics. You had no right to interfere." He shifted his stance slightly toward Deputy Harris, shoulders angling in a way that tried to pull the deputy into his orbit. "You have my report, Deputy. Sentinel Protective Services will be pressing charges for theft and interference with our operations. We'll also be contacting the owner of that storage facility. I doubt he wants a liability like this man jeopardizing his contracts." The implication landed like a physical blow. Martin thought of his trailer parked by the rows of storage units, of the agreement with Harold that let him live there cheap in exchange for keeping an eye on the place. The fragile sense of having a corner of the world that was his own felt suddenly very breakable. Harris cleared his throat, eyes moving from Clint's confident stance to Martin's quiet one, then to Ranger, who lay with his head still against Martin's leg, watching the humans with a calm that made the tension in the room feel even sharper. "Mr. Maddox," the deputy said carefully, "I'm here to take statements, not make decisions on the spot. Dr. Lewis, can you confirm the condition the dog was in when he arrived?" Karen nodded, folding her arms. "Severely underweight, dehydrated, with injuries consistent with overwork and neglect," she said. "I have photographs and medical notes to back that up. If this is how Sentinel treats its assets, I'd say Mr. Hale's intervention probably saved the dog's life." Linda stepped closer, resting a reassuring hand lightly on Ranger's back. "He didn't growl once, even when he hurt," she added quietly, looking at Harris rather than Clint. "He just endured. That tells you something about what he's used to." Her voice wasn't accusatory, just sad. And that sadness seemed to make more of a dent in the deputy than anger might have. Clint rolled his eyes, irritation bleeding through his controlled demeanor. "You people love a sob story," he said. "Let me be clear. That animal is registered to Sentinel Protective Services. We have the paperwork. This man took him without permission from our training site. I don't care how noble he thought he was being. The law calls that theft. Either he returns company property immediately, or we'll resolve it in court and with the property owner. I'm sure Mr. Benton won't be thrilled to learn his tenant is meddling in things he doesn't understand." The mention of Harold's name, spoken so casually by this outsider, made Martin's stomach twist. So Clint had already done his homework. Of course he had. Men like him didn't walk into a situation until they knew where the pressure points were. Martin felt all eyes turn to him then. The vet steady, supportive, Linda's anxious but encouraging. The deputies uncertain, Clint's cold and measuring. He ran a hand down Ranger's neck, feeling the warmth under the rough fur, the answering thump of the dog's tail against his boot. He thought of the back lot at night, the chain grinding against metal, the hoarse bark in the dark that no one else had been around to hear. "I didn't steal him," he said, his voice low but carrying. "I found a living being, left out there like trash. No food in reach, no shelter worth a damn in that wind. If I'd walked away, he'd be dead now. Maybe your forms would still say asset in training, but there'd be nothing left breathing. I won't apologize for not walking away." His words hung in the air, not loud, but weighted with a kind of tired conviction that came from years of knowing what it felt like to arrive just a little too late. For a heartbeat, something flickered in Harris's expression, respect, or at least understanding. But Clint only narrowed his pale eyes. "Then we'll see what a judge thinks," he snapped. "Deputy, you have our position. Dr. Lewis, expect a call from our legal department. Mr. Hale, I suggest you consider how much that rusted-out trailer and patch of gravel mean to you before you dig in your heels." Without waiting for a reply, he turned on his heel and strode out, the clinic door swinging shut behind him with a chime that sounded falsely cheerful in the thick air he left behind. The rumble of the truck faded a moment later, but the threat did not. That night, back at the storage yard, the wind was up again, threading through the gaps between the units, making them hum softly like distant voices. Martin sat on the top step of his trailer. Ranger sprawled on the wooden boards beside him, head within easy reach of his hand. The dog's body was warmer now, flesh slowly filling back over bone thanks to regular meals. But he still seemed to take up surprisingly little space when he curled close. Martin's hand moved in slow strokes along his back, feeling the ridges of old scars beneath the fur. The stars were hidden behind a layer of cloud, and the yard lights cast long, lonely shadows across the rows of metal doors. In the distance, he could just make out the darker rectangle of the back lot, a flat expanse of gravel that everyone had agreed was useless. Clint's words kept looping in his mind. Tenant, contracts, property, twining with an older, quieter fear. The memory of duffel bags packed too quickly, barracks cleared out, orders handed down that gave no room for argument. He had built this small, modest life over years, one steady day at a time, and now the thought of losing even this worn step and thin-walled trailer made his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. A car engine approached, softer than Clint's aggressive truck, and a moment later tires crunched on gravel near the office. Ranger's ears lifted, but his body stayed relaxed. When Martin rose to see who it was, the dog followed at his heel without needing to be told. Linda's sedan sat under the yard light, its paint dulled by age but clearly cared for. She emerged carrying a covered baking dish in both hands, the steam seeping from under the foil, making the cold night air smell briefly of cinnamon and apples. Under the yellow light, she looked a little tired, the skin under her eyes faintly shadowed. But her smile when she saw Martin and Ranger was genuine. "I figured you two might not have thought about dessert," she said, climbing the steps carefully. Up close, he could see that she'd changed out of her clinic clothes into a soft gray sweater and jeans, her silver-brown hair loose around her face. "I bake when I'm worried. Bad habit. You're doing me a favor by taking some of it off my hands." They sat there on the steps for a while, sharing warm cobbler out of mismatched bowls, their shoulders not quite touching, Ranger's head resting contentedly on Linda's knee whenever she paused between bites to scratch behind his ears. The simple domesticity of it, the clink of spoons, the puff of their breath in the cold, the dog wedged happily between them, felt almost unreal to Martin, like a scene borrowed from a life he'd never quite managed to have. Conversation drifted easily at first, circling around small things, the weather, a stray cat that liked to sun itself on the clinic's windowsill, a recipe Linda was trying to get right. Eventually, though, her gaze followed his out toward the dark shape of the back lot. "You've always said that patch was worthless," she murmured, voice somewhere between teasing and thoughtful. "Just a forgotten corner. But if it turns out to be the place where you and Ranger start something new, does it still count as useless?" Martin let the question hang, the spoon cooling in his hand as he studied the shape of his future in that rough rectangle of stone and dust. He imagined, just for a second, something other than empty space there. Maybe a fence, a couple of runs, a sign with a name that meant second chances for more than one living soul. The idea was so fragile it almost hurt to look at directly. "If I push back against Maddox," he said quietly, more to himself than to Linda, "I could lose all of it. The job, this trailer, that ground. Then it really would be just Ranger and me, with nowhere to land." Ranger shifted then, pressing his weight a little more firmly against Martin's leg, as if adding his own small vote to the tally. Martin's fingers settled in the fur at his neck, holding on loosely. For the first time in years, his life was not just about avoiding loss, but about choosing what he was willing to risk for something that felt right. And he had to wonder, as the wind whispered over the empty lot, whether hanging on to safety was worth more than fighting for the one place and the one creature that made him feel needed again. The bad news started arriving on paper. A week after Clint stormed out of the clinic, an envelope from the county courthouse showed up in Martin's narrow metal mailbox by the office door, its official seal sitting on the front like a small, heavy fist. Inside was a notice of complaint. Sentinel Protective Services v. Martin Hale, alleging unlawful possession of company property and interference with business operations. Someone had underlined the hearing date in red before slipping it into the mail stream, as if to make sure he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it. 2 days later, Harold called him into the office. The older man's shoulders slumped in a way Martin had never seen before. "I got a call from Sentinel's people," Harold said, rubbing a hand over his face. "They're asking questions about liability, talking about reputational risk. They're not saying fire him outright, but they're reminding me that our contract with them comes up for renewal next spring." His blue eyes were apologetic, almost ashamed. "I like you here, Marty. You do good work. But I gotta be honest. If this turns into a mess, I might have to revisit the arrangement. The trailer spot, the lease. I don't want to, but..." He let the sentence trail off, hands opening helplessly. Walking back across the yard afterward, the notice in his pocket and Harold's worry in his ears, Martin felt as if his whole life had been hung from some invisible hook, dangling over an open drop. The trailer, the job, the small routines that had stitched his days together. Suddenly they all looked borrowed, revocable, as temporary as a duffel bag on a cot. The night the wind really came up, it whistled through the storage yard like it was trying to peel the metal doors off their tracks. Martin had given up on sleep, lying fully clothed on his narrow bed with Ranger curled on the blanket by his side, when the dog's head snapped up. 1 second he'd been breathing slow and steady. The next he was on his feet, ears pricked, muscles coiled. A low, sharp bark burst from his chest, nothing like the hoarse sounds Martin remembered from the night they met. "What is it?" Martin muttered, already swinging his legs over the side of the bed. Before he could stand, Ranger was at the door, scratching once, then turning back to look at him, issuing another urgent, clipped bark. It carried a note Martin recognized from old days. The tone a dog uses when danger isn't hypothetical. He grabbed his jacket, jammed his feet into his boots without lacing them, and opened the door. The wind slapped cold air in his face, but underneath it, another smell rolled in thick and wrong. Sharp, chemical, and choking. Smoke. Ranger launched down the steps and across the gravel toward the line of older trailers parked beyond the main office, where folks who couldn't afford much rented long-term spots and made do. As Martin rounded the corner, he saw it. A dull orange flicker licking out from under the frame of a 30-year-old camper, black smoke pouring from a cracked rear window. His heart lurched. He knew that unit. A woman in her early 30s had moved in a few months back. Slight and wiry, with dark hair usually pulled into a messy knot and a face that tried to look tougher than it was. He'd learned in bits and pieces that her name was Jenna, that she worked nights at the grocery store, and that her 6-year-old grandson sometimes stayed with her when his mother couldn't keep things together. The grocery's parking lot had carried that story in the low murmur of clerks' voices. In town, nothing stayed secret for long. Now the little trailer where they slept was breathing smoke like a wounded thing. Ranger was already at the door, barking hard, front paws striking the thin metal. Martin didn't stop to calculate legal consequences or wait for the fire department that was 10 precious minutes away. He yanked his bandana from his pocket, pressed it over his nose and mouth, and used his shoulder as a battering ram. The flimsy door gave on the second hit, hinges shrieking. Heat and smoke belched out, stinging his eyes. Inside, through the haze, he could see the orange glow deeper toward the rear, where some overloaded extension cord had finally surrendered. Between him and the fire, on the fold-out bed, was a huddled shape. Jenna, coughing in her sleep, and at her feet, a small form curled under a blanket. "Jenna!" he shouted, pushing forward. The air burned his lungs, but Ranger plunged in ahead of him, low to the ground where the smoke was thinner. The dog reached the bed first, pressing his nose hard against the woman's arm. Then the lump of the child's shoulder, barking in short, urgent bursts. The boy stirred first, a thin, freckled face emerging from the blanket, eyes wide with confusion that snapped into fear as the dog's bark and the crackle of fire registered. Martin grabbed him under the arms, hauling him upright. "We've got you," he rasped. "Come on." He shoved the child toward the doorway where cooler night air waited, then turned back for Jenna, who was waking more slowly, mind thick with sleep and smoke. By then, one of the neighbors, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and a t-shirt half tucked into flannel pajama pants, had arrived at the door, drawn by the commotion. "Take the kid," Martin shouted, coughing. The man reached in, hands wrapping around the little boy, pulling him out into the hiss of the wind. Martin bent to hoist Jenna, and that was when Ranger did the thing that would stick in everyone's memory. A section of the ceiling by the kitchenette sagged with a groan, giving way in a shower of sparks and debris. In the chaos, the boy, dazed and panicked, tried to scramble back toward the doorway, calling for his grandmother. A flaming chunk of insulation fell where he had just been standing. Ranger spun, teeth flashing, not in aggression, but in desperate, focused intent. He clamped his mouth gently, but firmly, around the sleeve of the boy's pajamas and tugged him sideways, dragging him out of the path of the collapse. The child cried out, more startled than hurt. And then he was outside, stumbling into his neighbor's arms as another piece of the ceiling came down where his head would have been. When Martin and Jenna stumbled out a heartbeat later, both coughing, everyone's eyes were on the dog. Ranger emerged last, coat speckled with ash, coughing out a rough bark, then circling back to touch his nose to the boy's knee as if to count him present. For a moment, no one spoke. It was the heavy-set neighbor who broke the silence. "I thought that was the dangerous dog," he said, voice hoarse with smoke and something like awe. In the days that followed, as the fire department declared faulty wiring and the Red Cross arranged a motel for Jenna and her grandson, the story of what had happened in the night ran through Fairview like a current. How the old vet from the storage yard and his German shepherd had pulled two people out of a burning trailer. How the dog had gone back for the boy. Folks who had eyed Ranger warily in the parking lot now bent to scratch his ears when they came by for storage payments or gas. "Good boy," they murmured. And more than one pair of eyes flicked between Martin and the dog with a newfound respect. The warmth of that shift should have been comforting, but it came with a shadow. The court date on the complaint notice hadn't changed. Clint's threats still hung over the yard. Saving lives in the middle of the night didn't erase legal paperwork. Martin felt the contradiction sitting in his chest like two stones grinding against each other. The town beginning to see Ranger as a hero, while the company that owned his microchip still called him stolen property. It was Ranger who led him to the next truth. 2 or 3 days after the fire, Martin was making his usual afternoon round along the fence line of the back lot, the complaint letter a folded weight in his jacket pocket. The wind had dropped, leaving the yard oddly quiet. The only sound the soft pad of Ranger's paws beside him and the occasional clink of the dog's collar ring against his tags. When they reached the far corner where the chain-link fence bowed outward slightly, Ranger stopped dead. His body went still, nose lifting, then lowering as he sniffed along the bottom of the fence. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not loud, but persistent. He looked back at Martin, then returned his focus to a section where the metal had gone rusty and thin. "What is it, boy?" Martin asked, already knowing he should probably keep walking. Instead, he stepped closer. The ground there was scuffed bare and shoved up against the fence. Half hidden under a warped sheet of plywood were 3 old wire dog crates. Their doors hung crooked, the metal scraped and bent in places where something inside had thrown its weight against them again and again. Inside one sat a cracked plastic water dish, dry and dusty. Nearby, tangled in the weeds, were 2 leather collars, one with a broken buckle, both worn in the familiar way of things used hard and long. He crouched, knees popping, and picked up one of the collars. It was a different make than Ranger's, but the feel was the same. Good leather left to weather, stained dark where it had once rested warm against a neck. His thumb ran over the worn groove where a nameplate might have been attached and later removed. A third object lay half buried in the gravel, a short length of chain with a snap on one end, scuffed and rusted like the one he'd torn free that first night. Individually, they might have meant nothing. Together, arranged in that forgotten corner, they sketched a pattern he didn't want to see. This wasn't a one-time training ground. Dogs had been here before Ranger, maybe many of them, stashed out of sight where no one would ask questions about how they were treated because no one knew they were there. The realization chilled him more than the wind ever could. Martin straightened slowly, the collars in one hand, the chain in the other, his phone heavy in the pocket of his jacket. He should document this, he knew, take pictures before anyone moved anything, create a record that didn't depend on his word alone. His fingers felt clumsy as he pulled the phone out and snapped photo after photo. The crates, the rusted fence, the scatter of old hardware in the dirt. Ranger standing stiff and alert beside them, like a grim witness. With each shutter click, his heart sank a little further. If the back lot he walked every day, the place he might lose if Clint had his way, was being used as a quiet dumping ground for overworked dogs, then looking the other way made him part of the machinery that hurt them. But dragging it into the light meant inviting more trouble. Legal fights, corporate anger, maybe even the loss of the only home he'd managed to hold on to this long. As Ranger pressed his shoulder lightly against Martin's leg, eyes lifted in that steady, questioning way, Martin felt the weight of those choices settle in, and he couldn't help wondering whether he had the strength to turn his own life upside down, just to tell the truth about what had been done in the dark. The county courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the kind of scent that made Martin think of orders handed down and signatures that could rearrange lives. He paused just inside the front doors, adjusted the collar of his red and black jacket, and felt for the familiar weight of his watch on his wrist, as if the steady tick might anchor him. Ranger walked at his side on the worn leather lead, head level, gait calm, nails clicking softly on the linoleum. A security guard at the checkpoint, an older woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, hesitated when she saw the dog, but when Martin handed over the judge's written allowance for Ranger to be present, she just nodded and reached out to let the shepherd sniff her hand. "Good-looking boy," she murmured. Ranger accepted the brief touch, then moved on, as if he understood that today was work of a different kind. In the hearing room, the rows of wooden benches and the elevated dais at the front made him feel, absurdly, like a kid called into the principal's office, except this time it wasn't just his own skin at stake. Clint was already there, seated at a polished table to the right with his attorney. The lawyer was a man in his early 50s, tall and lean, in a dark suit that fit like it had been measured down to the millimeter. His hair was salt and pepper, combed back from a narrow, angular face dominated by sharp cheekbones and a thin mouth that rarely moved except to shape precise, clipped words. Steel-framed glasses framed cool gray eyes that flicked over Martin and Ranger as if cataloging weaknesses. Beside them sat a 3-person panel who would be making the recommendation in the dispute. At the center, Judge Elaine Porter, a woman in her early 60s with a solid build, short silver hair, and a face that carried both authority and tired compassion. To her right, a bespectacled man in his 70s, in a tweed jacket, who had the air of a retired teacher. To her left, a younger woman in her 40s, with dark curls pinned back loosely and an alert, serious expression, her pen already poised over a legal pad. Martin took a seat at the opposite table with Dr. Karen Lewis and Linda behind him, their presence a quiet weight of support. Ranger lay down at his feet without being told, curling so that his side pressed gently against Martin's boot, his head resting on his paws, eyes open but soft. The attorney rose first, voice smooth as he addressed the panel. He painted Ranger as an asset. A highly trained protection dog, bred and conditioned for high-intensity security duties, and Martin as an unstable variable. "Mr. Hale is a veteran with a documented history of combat service," the lawyer said, letting the word combat hang in the air like a diagnosis. "While we respect his prior service, it is also clear that individuals with his background can be prone to volatility, particularly under stress. Sentinel. Protective Services maintain strict protocols for handling animals of this caliber, allowing such a dog to remain in the possession of a private citizen, especially one who is, by his own admission, struggling with past trauma, is a danger to the community." Clint sat with arms folded, nodding occasionally, the picture of reasonable concern. Ranger, as if in quiet rebuttal, let out a slow sigh and shifted only enough to get more comfortable, the leather of his collar creaking softly. When the lawyer referred to Ranger as dangerous, unpredictable, and difficult to control, Martin felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, counting the beats the way he'd been taught years ago in a very different kind of briefing room. He thought of the boy in the burning trailer, of the gentle pressure of teeth on a pajama sleeve that had been firm enough to pull, but careful not to bruise. Beside him, Linda shifted, her hand brushing his shoulder for a brief second, a silent reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. When the lawyer sat down, having laid out the narrative of a reckless old soldier and a weaponized animal, Judge Porter's gaze shifted to Martin. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice carrying across the room without needing to be raised. "You and your counsel may respond." Martin rose slowly. He didn't have a lawyer of his own, just a folder of papers, a stack of photographs, and the weight of his own word. His hand trembled slightly as he gathered his notes. He didn't bother to hide it. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, clearing his throat. His voice sounded rough in his own ears, but it held. "Name's Martin Hale. I served in the Army, rescue and support units for a little over 20 years. I've seen what happens when people get left behind." He glanced down at Ranger, who looked up at the sound of his name and gave a small, encouraging thump of his tail. "The night I found this dog, he was chained in the back corner of a lot. I walk every day. No food where he could reach it. No real shelter from the wind. He was skin and bone, paws torn up, more scars on him than I could count." He flipped open the folder and laid out the photographs he'd taken. The bent crates, the empty dish, the collars in the dirt, the close-ups of raw skin under matted fur. These were not taken at some fancy training facility. They were taken behind a storage yard in Fairview, where no one was supposed to see. He swallowed, then nodded to Karen, who brought up a tablet. "We also have this," he said. "A short video from 2 nights ago." He tapped the screen, and the panel watched as grainy footage played. A Sentinel truck backing quietly into the alley behind the storage units, men's voices barking orders. The muted but unmistakable sounds of dogs whining, a sharp cry, cut off mid-whimper. Martin had filmed it from the shadow of his trailer, hands shaking with both anger and fear. And even on the small screen, the unease was palpable. When the clip ended, the room felt heavier. "I'm not a lawyer," he went on, "but I know what I'm seeing, and I know neglect when I smell it." Karen then stepped forward to summarize her medical findings in calm, clinical terms. Ranger's malnutrition, the calluses and joint strain consistent with overwork, the lack of routine care. Her professionalism stripped away emotion, leaving only facts that were hard to argue with. Then came the softer voices. Jenna sat at the witness stand, nervous in a borrowed blouse and skirt. Her dark hair pulled back into a braid that made her look younger than her 30-odd years. Her hands twisted in her lap as she told the story of waking in smoke, of a big dog's bark in the dark, of strong arms hauling her and her grandson out. Her voice broke when she described turning to see Ranger dragging the little boy away from the collapsing ceiling. When her grandson was called, the boy hesitated at the front of the room, small shoulders hunched in his too big button-down shirt. He couldn't have been more than 6, his freckles stark against pale skin, his eyes wide as he scanned the benches. Martin watched him spot Ranger. Something in the child's posture eased. With a questioning glance at the judge, the boy took a few steps toward the shepherd. The bailiff started to move, but Judge Porter held up a hand. "Let's see," she said quietly. The boy approached Ranger, who lay utterly still, ears flicking once in mild curiosity. Slowly, with the tentative courage of children who have seen both danger and rescue in the same night, the boy wrapped his thin arms around the dog's neck. Ranger did not stiffen or pull away. He simply turned his head slightly, giving the child more room, and his tail gave a gentle, rhythmic wag across the floor. The panel watched in silence. The image of a so-called uncontrollable, dangerous animal, accepting a frightened child's embrace without so much as a twitch of unease, undercut pages of legal argument. "Is this the dog you're afraid of?" the retired teacher on the panel asked softly, half to himself. Jenna's eyes met Martin's briefly. Gratitude and fear mingled there. She knew, as he did, that none of this guaranteed anything. But it was at least the truth laid bare. The spell broke when Sentinel's lawyer rose again, trying to steer the narrative back. He questioned Karen's conclusions, implying bias. He suggested that the crates and collars could belong to anyone. He framed the late-night video as taken out of context. But something had shifted in the room, and maybe in Clint himself. Under repeated questions from the younger woman on the panel about company policy for retired dogs and what exactly asset rotation meant, irritation began to fray his polished demeanor. His answers grew shorter, sharper. Finally, when she pressed, "So what happens when a dog like Ranger is no longer considered useful to your company?" Clint's composure cracked. "We don't run a petting zoo," he snapped, color rising in his cheeks. "They're tools. When they're no good, you move on. You don't waste money fixing broken equipment." The words hung in the air like the echo of a slammed door. Martin watched the faces on the bench as that sentiment settled. The older man's mouth tightened. The younger woman's eyebrows drew together in something like disgust. Judge Porter's expression didn't change much, but her eyes, the clear gray blue of someone who'd sat through more human messes than she could count, hardened just a fraction. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Martin felt Ranger shift against his boot, the dog's warmth a steady presence at his side, and he understood with sudden, startling clarity that this was his line in the sand. He had spent a lifetime following orders, doing what was asked, swallowing his own ghosts so the machinery around him could keep moving. If he sat back now, if he let people like Clint define what lives mattered and which ones were disposable, then every night spent hauling wounded men out of fire and dust would feel like it had been for nothing. As he met Judge Porter's gaze, the question that formed in his mind was not whether he could afford to speak, but whether he could live with himself if he didn't. By the time spring settled properly over Fairview, the back lot didn't look like the same forgotten patch of gravel. The fence line had been replaced, the old sagging sections hauled away, and new posts sunk straight into the earth. Fresh chain link glinted under the morning sun. And on the gate, bolted carefully at eye level, hung a modest wooden sign that Harold had carved himself on his days off. Second Chance Yard, the letters burned dark into the grain. Martin had run his thumb over them the first time he saw it, the words landing somewhere deep in his chest. The court had granted him full ownership of Ranger and a small, provisional license to operate a rehabilitation space for rescue dogs, contingent on regular inspections and the vet's oversight. It wasn't much on paper. But standing there in his red and black jacket, boots dusted with the gravel of a place people used to call useless, it felt like more than he'd ever expected to hold this late in life. Inside the fence, the world had shifted from empty to purposeful. A row of simple kennels built from lumber donated by the hardware store and sweat from half the neighborhood stood along one side, each with a covered section for shade and a run that opened into a shared play area. There were only 3 new occupants to start, a nervous hound mix with ribs still faintly visible, a small brown dog with one ear that refused to stand up straight, and an older mutt with cloudy eyes who preferred to sit close to the fence and watch. Ranger moved among them with the quiet authority of someone who knew both sides of the fence. He would trot alongside Martin as they opened kennel doors in the morning, then circle back, offering a sniff here, a playbow there, a patient presence when one of the newcomers flinched at a raised hand or a sudden sound. "You remember what it was like, don't you, boy?" Martin would murmur, watching as Ranger lay down just far enough away to give a frightened dog space, but close enough that they could feel they weren't alone. Most afternoons, the boy from the burned trailer showed up as predictably as the male. His name was Eli, and now that he was back to school, he came over after classes, his backpack bouncing against his small shoulders as he ran down the lane. Jenna would watch from the road, or just inside the gate, her dark hair loose around a face that had begun to look less haunted and more tired in the ordinary way of working mothers and grandmothers. Eli always headed straight for Ranger, launching a tennis ball with an enthusiasm that made up for his still too thin arms. Ranger would lope after it, return, drop it at the boy's feet with a soft huff, and then lope again, never taking advantage of his superior speed, as if he understood the game was about more than the ball. Sometimes, when Eli got bored of fetch, he would wander over to the kennels, pressing his freckled nose to the wire and telling the new dogs, in the solemn way of children, about that night, and how he wasn't scared anymore because Rangers got us. The newcomers didn't answer, of course, but some days their tails thumped faintly against the concrete, and Martin counted that as a small win. Linda became part of the landscape almost without comment. On cold mornings, her old sedan pulled into the lot just as the sky was starting to pink at the edges, trunk full of things she insisted were extras from her kitchen or garage. She was still in her late 50s, her silver-brown hair usually pulled back under a knit cap, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening when she smiled. She would step out cradling a thermos and a paper sack, the smell of coffee and something warm, cinnamon rolls, muffins, one glorious morning an entire loaf of banana bread, cutting through the chill. "Fuel for the boss," she'd say lightly, handing Martin a steaming cup. He'd grumble a token protest about not being anyone's boss. Then their fingers would brush on the cardboard sleeve, and for half a second, neither of them would pull away. It wasn't the stuff of movies. No declarations, no sweeping gestures. Just two people of a certain age moving side by side through chores. Scrubbing water buckets, checking latches, arguing gently about the best brand of dog food. When she laughed at something he said, which wasn't often, but happened more lately, he found himself looking away. Not because he was embarrassed, but because the warmth in his chest was still a new, tender thing. The town had begun to claim the place, too. A coffee tin appeared on the counter in the storage office with a handwritten label. Donations for second chances. Crumpled bills and a few checks found their way into it, some from people Martin barely knew except by the units they rented. One afternoon, the high school shop teacher dropped off a set of homemade agility ramps, eyebrows raised as if daring Martin to refuse. A retired couple brought over a box of old blankets that used to belong to our lab. Harold, who had once talked about revisiting the lease, now walked the fence line with a pride that puffed his chest slightly. He was in his late 60s, balding, with a paunch he disguised poorly under plaid shirts. But when he pointed out a section of the yard to a visitor and said, "We built that," his face looked almost boyish. "Never thought this old place would be good for anything but boxes and dust," he told Martin one evening as they watched Ranger supervise a cautious game of chase among the dogs. "Guess I was wrong." There was no apology in it, just the simple admission of a man happy to be proven mistaken. In the quiet hour between afternoon and dusk, when the dogs were fed and settled, and the town's noise had faded to a distant hum, Martin liked to sit on the trailer steps the way he always had. The difference now was what lay before him. Instead of an empty, wind-scoured lot, he saw movement and small, ordinary miracles. A once silent dog barking hoarsely at a passing squirrel for the first time. Eli's bright jacket streaking across the yard as he ran. Linda wiping her hands on a towel, leaving a smear of soap on her cheek. Harold's old truck pulling away, with its bed empty for once, no longer hauling away the past, but making space for what might come next. Ranger would climb the steps without asking, turning in a circle before settling with his head on Martin's knee, the familiar weight anchoring him. Up close, the scars on the dog's flanks were just pale lines under healthy fur, reminders of what he'd survived rather than marks of what defined him. Sometimes Martin thought back to the night he'd first heard that thin, hoarse bark cutting through the wind, a sound he could so easily have pretended not to hear. He remembered the way the chain had sounded when he broke it loose, the way Ranger's eyes had met his with a kind of weary, stubborn hope. Back then, he had believed he was dragging a broken animal out of a dead corner of the world. Now, watching the sun sink low and turn the fence, the kennels, even his old jacket to shades of copper and gold, he understood that the rescue had never been a one-way street. He had needed, more than he'd allowed himself to admit, something to show up in the middle of his barren, well-defended life and ask without words, "Will you stay? Will you show up again tomorrow?" Ranger had done that simply by existing, by needing him, by trusting him enough to follow. As evening settled and the sky bled into a soft, deep blue, Martin lifted his hand and scratched gently behind Ranger's ears. The dog sighed in contentment, eyes half closing, utterly at ease in a yard that once held only emptiness. Beyond the fence, the town went on. People cooking dinners, watching TV, arguing or laughing in houses Martin would probably never see inside. But here, on this ground that used to be an afterthought, lives were quietly being stitched back together. A boy who no longer woke screaming from smoke-filled dreams. A woman who didn't have to face every struggle alone. A handful of dogs learning that hands could bring food and comfort instead of pain. And an old soldier who had stopped counting his days by what he'd lost and started measuring them by what and who he could still show up for. He looked down at Ranger, at the worn leather collar and the steady rise and fall of his chest, and smiled to himself. "Guess we both got a second chance, huh, partner?" he said softly. Ranger's tail thumped once in answer, and for the first time in a long time, Martin felt sure that whatever tomorrow brought, he and this scarred, steadfast dog would be there to meet it together. In the end, Martin comes to see that what looked like an accident on a cold, empty lot was never just chance at all. A starving dog and a tired old soldier met in the dark because a quiet God still weaves small miracles into ordinary evenings, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, to remind us that no life is worthless, no heart is too late for a second chance. And if he can turn a forgotten patch of gravel into a place of healing, he can also touch the hidden wastelands in our own days. The loneliness at the kitchen table, the quiet worry over children and grandchildren, the feeling that our best years are behind us. If this story stirred something in you, would you share it with a friend who might need hope today? Leave a comment with the name of a person or a pet you're praying for. And tell us how God has sent rangers into your life. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story of grace and second chances. And as you do, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Watch over your home, your family, and every creature He's placed in your care, today and every day.